Let me get your sense then of Africa's economic story and what the G20 has got to offer for us.
That's a very good one, because Africa, at this point in time, the fundamentals still do look relatively weak, but certainly promising. Obviously, the main challenge that African countries are currently confronted with is the issue of debt and defaulting on their developmental aspirations or developmental goals. The issues of disaster risk management are still thinly being dealt with, the issues of climate change in the continent. But primarily, I think from your conversation with Sophie as well, the integration of the African market. This is very important, because you obviously for you to have a stronger Africa and therefore a better world, you need that integration, and that integration would come in the form of infrastructure, in the form of the financial institutions, capital markets, and therefore you are able to facilitate trade and the movement of goods and services across the continent. But a lot of progress is probably being done in these areas. It's just perhaps coming a bit slowly, but trade volume, intercontinental trade volumes have increased significantly in the last couple of years. So that's where the conditions are. But I mean, maybe to mention as well, Thembekile, the issue of peace and security in the continent still remains a huge challenge, which of course would pose serious challenges to inclusive economic growth and inclusive sustainable development goals. I think that's where we are at the moment, and the big ups to South Africa for putting the continent in the map when it hosts the Group of 20 leaders, because South Africa then did not necessarily advance, it would seem, an agenda that is South Africa focused, but that which is African focused on these areas I've also touched on.
Right. And on that point then, to what extent is the age-old tradition, shall we say, of the more developed nations seeing Africa as a place where they use their money to assert influence, or where Africa often goes to them with a begging bowl in exchange for minerals, etc. Is that changing? And how important is it that we do see that change if ultimately the continent's economy is to thrive?
Certainly, I think that is changing. For instance, there's been quite a lot of bilateral conversations that have been going on leading up to the G20 summit, but also during this past week, a lot of colleagues in various departments have been meeting up with their counterparts to advance these ideas. For instance, one of the things that were the president's priorities is harnessing critical minerals for inclusive economic growth. And countries, because South Africa hosts a number of these critical minerals that can be used to develop new technologies, whether for AI or for the energy transitions to more renewable energy sources. And there's been some bilateral conversations with countries such as Japan, the EU, and others, where South Africa is emphasizing the idea of value creation and beneficiation at source. But of course, South Africa shouldn't and probably doesn't go to these conversations alone. It carries the bloc, SADC, ECOWA, and other regional blocs in the continent that obviously survey these critical minerals and would be able to benefit from them. To put it quite simple, to say that Africa does not only require investment for the purposes of extraction, but it does require investment and technological transfer where you are able to create the value at source. And Africa is no longer the colony that is going to export raw materials, but it is going to be able to facilitate production at source and create employment and empower women and facilitate integration in the continent, and be able to therefore go out to the broader world and say, this is what we have as Africa, and this is what we can produce as Africa, and this is what you can buy from us, and therefore retain value for the continent and prosper.
What position then does South Africa hold in advancing that very goal?
South Africa, I mean, has been a huge leader in the multilateral space and has been a huge leader as well in the continent, including in the SADC region, insofar as facilitating the trade agreements. For instance, the AfCFTA initiatives that have been led throughout the two colleagues at TTIC have also been one of the significant measures that South Africa has been doing. I think also hosting a lot of African countries here, many of which have not been here before, to allow them to facilitate these trade negotiations with their counterparts in other continents is creating that space which South Africa has always played in saying that we are going to be a gateway to the continent to ensure the prosperity of the continent and leaving no one behind. This is challenging, of course, because we still have our own domestic challenges, particularly infrastructure and facilitating trade. But the measures that they've been using for AfCFTA to say, from the onstart, we are going to create digital infrastructure to fast track and facilitate trade within the continent and the other continents as well. It's one of the good initiatives where you don't start on the very technical, slow paces on integrating trade, but you clear out custom integration as well to ensure that trade is facilitated more quickly. And I always stress, Thembekile, that what's important is also financial integration. And South Africa has most of its banks in the continent. They have footprint in the continent. We need those capital markets to be further developed to ensure that regional trade also occurs in regional currencies. And this is kind of the work that South Africa is playing with the most with one of the most sophisticated banking systems and capital markets in the world. So these are some of the transfers that I think South Africa is going to give to the continent, and hopefully this can be accelerated more quickly.
But there is the challenge, isn't there, Doctor, that there is still a bit of a complication, if you will, around the movement of goods and people, even on the continent. To get to some parts of Africa, as a South African, you may still have to, for a more pleasant journey, for want of a better word, go through Europe or the Gulf and then fly back to Africa. How much of a hindrance is that for a continent that wants to have countries work together and make money together?
It's a huge problem, Thembekile. I mean, South Africa is exploring the idea of e-visas, for instance, but infrastructure is going to take us a long time to develop to be able to integrate the continent. And the financing gap is calculated, obviously, in trillions of dollars to make that a reality. But I think if we can start at regional integration, then that could be a first step in making sure that that integration takes place. The AfCFTA agreement, the trade agreement in the continent, is going to be very difficult without infrastructure and investment. Like I said at the beginning, that one of the biggest challenges that African countries still face is the debt burden, which means that they are unable to finance education, health, let alone infrastructure, to be able to facilitate trade. If we obviously lose opportunities like this, where we're able to bilaterally engage with different countries and different continents, and then push that to say that South Africa not only is able, and the continent not only is able to promote culture and peace, but we also have interest in terms of economic integration. And therefore, we want to retain value in the continent and not only export raw materials. That was going to obviously give us a footing to say we are not going to be able to create ports that facilitate trade into the rest of the world, but we are going to be able to put on the table the importance of the intercontinental trade movement. So certainly those challenges, Thembekile, are there, and they are huge hindrance into the continent integrating, not only culturally, where people move between countries and facilitating tourism, etc., but trade, you know, the movement of goods and services. This is a huge problem. And that financial integration challenge I was telling you about as well. It's a big problem unless the continent also integrates financially and builds strong capital markets. Then you are going to be able to facilitate a lot of the infrastructure projects. You are going to be able to facilitate a lot of the movement in the continent. And the direction needs to be both ways, you know, where the direction is not only south or east, but we're moving across the continent, and there's huge volumes of currency exchange, which would, of course, then develop our financial markets even further.
Lastly, the inequality report that was handed over to President Cyril Ramaphosa, I think 2-3 weeks ago, made it clear that the top 1% of the world's richest people continue to get richer, while the poor are getting poorer. But also, alarmingly, to something that you touched on, we're seeing a drop in investment in health. And if health is wealth, why aren't we seeing more money being poured into that? And what will be the ultimate cost for countries that are not spending on caring for a population to keep it healthy, to treat the sick?
Thembekile, I think this is probably one of the most important reports to have come out of our G20, the inequality report, which was chaired by Professor Stiglitz, because it actually goes down to the crux of the international financial architecture since its development and integration. And the importance of this is to acknowledge that many people, I don't know if I'm still with you, Thembekile.
We are still able to hear you, Doctor. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. This is important. This is very important because all the inequalities that exist in the world emanate from this: social, economical, education, climate change, trust and treasons, etc., underpinned by the ultra wealth. And it's good that we are having this conversation at a G20 level because it is these countries that, of course, have enabled the idea of globalization. But one of the ills that have come out of integrating the global system with an untransformed international financial architecture has meant that a lot of people are holding wealth in the form of assets and they're unable to invest in the real economy. So we are hoping that you are going to begin to see this report being facilitated at a forum such as the UN that is going to allow intergovernmental processes on domestic revenue mobilization, because you have a lot of challenges in terms of illicit financial flows that underpin the issue of mobilizing revenue for countries to finance their expenditures. So this is a very good one. We need to talk about the taxing of the ultra wealth. We need to talk about the taxing of the multinational corporations that operate in different countries, especially as well as in Africa, to see how those countries, how those companies and how those people invest in the real economy in which they operate. So we've seen a lot of the inequality in the last 30 to 50 years. And this report hopefully needs to be implemented, its recommendations, so that we can see at an intergovernmental level measures that are going to safeguard domestic revenue mobilization.